Clara Vance, 30 years old, was the woman who had just been slapped to the floor by her own brother in a room filled with the most powerful people in the city. The sharp crack echoed beneath the crystal chandelier. The glass in Clara's hand fell onto the marble floor and shattered into dozens of pieces. Red wine spread beneath her feet like a pool of blood across the silver and white ballroom. No one stepped forward. Julian Vance stood over his sister, his hand still raised. His face was flushed with rage, but deep in his eyes was something else. Fear. He leaned down and forced out each word through clenched teeth. "What do you think you're doing here?" Clara pushed herself back to her feet, one side of her face burned. More than 300 guests were watching her, from bankers and investors to government officials who had once appeared beside the Vance family on the front pages of newspapers. This was supposed to be the greatest night in the history of the Vance Empire. 30 years since the corporation was founded. 30 years of speeches about honor, success, and social responsibility. But Clara knew the truth behind that glittering image. It had been built on fraudulent contracts, concealed accidents, and the silence of people who had been paid to look away. Julian grabbed her arm. "You weren't invited. You left this family years ago. Or did you run out of money and come back to blackmail us?" Clara did not resist. She simply looked down at Julian's hand tightening around her wrist. 5 years earlier, that same hand had ripped the first investigation file away from her. Back then, Clara had still been working for a major newspaper. She discovered that several workers at a Vance Empire construction site had been injured because the scaffolding system failed to meet safety standards. One man had died. The safety report had been altered. Witnesses had been pressured into silence. Clara had prepared to publish everything. Arthur Vance, her father, had summoned her home. He did not shout. He simply placed her mother's medical bills on the table and calmly told her that every payment would stop if the article was published. Clara withdrew the story. 3 months later, the newspaper fired her because she could not prove the allegations she had submitted. Arthur continued paying the medical expenses, but from that day forward, he used his wife's health like a rope tied around his daughter's neck. That was the dark side of the family corporation that no business magazine had ever mentioned. Now, inside a luxurious hotel surrounded by the white snow of Aspen, Arthur Vance stood beside the stage, staring at his daughter with cold, empty eyes. He approached her, adjusted his cuff, and spoke loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Your place is at home, taking care of your mother. Not here, offending my guests with your presence." A few people lowered their eyes to avoid Clara's gaze. Others quietly pulled out their phones and began recording. To them, this was nothing more than an unexpected family drama unfolding in the middle of a lavish celebration. But for Clara, this was the moment she had spent months preparing for. She looked at her father. "Mother died 6 weeks ago." Arthur froze for the briefest moment. Clara realized that he had not even known. Julian immediately yanked her toward the door. "Get out before I call security." At that moment, a man's voice rang out from beside the fireplace. "Take your hand off her." The entire ballroom fell silent. Mayor Marcus Sterling stepped away from the group of officials standing near the stage. He did not look at Clara first. His eyes settled directly on Julian's face. "Clara Vance did not come here to ask for money. She came at my invitation." Arthur narrowed his eyes. "What are you talking about?" The mayor removed a city-sealed file from inside his coat. "This morning, my office canceled the $500 million contract awarded to Vance Empire for the Central Harbor Bridge project." A wave of shock swept through the room. Marcus continued. "That decision was made after we received evidence from an investigative journalist exposing corruption. Someone who traced 4 shell companies, dozens of suspicious transactions, and a chain of contracts containing forged signatures." He turned toward Clara. "That person is standing in front of you." Julian released her wrist. For the first time in his life, Arthur Vance looked at his daughter and did not see a weak woman who needed to be controlled. He saw a threat. And Clara knew the party had only just begun. No one in the ballroom looked at Clara as though she were the family outcast anymore. The eyes that had once been filled with pity now held caution. A few people quietly put away their phones. Others turned toward Arthur and Julian, as though they were realizing for the first time that the 2 men standing on the stage no longer controlled the room. Arthur spoke first. He walked toward Clara and lowered his voice so the guests could not clearly hear him. "You have no idea what you're destroying." Clara looked directly into his eyes. "I know exactly what I'm destroying." She turned and walked toward the control table beside the large screen behind the stage. Julian immediately blocked her path. "You are not authorized to access company systems." Clara did not stop. Mayor Marcus Sterling stepped forward. "Let her continue." Julian turned toward his father, but Arthur remained silent. He was calculating. In his mind, every political connection, every campaign donation, and every person he could call before the night ended appeared one after another. He still believed this was merely a public relations crisis, a crisis that could be bought. Clara removed a black USB drive from her pocket and inserted it into the computer. The screen behind her went dark. A few seconds later, a financial diagram appeared. At its center was the Central Harbor Bridge project. 4 money trails branched away from it, leading to 4 companies with different registered addresses that all used the same accounting server. Clara picked up the microphone. These 4 companies received more than $80 million from the project budget. None of them have real employees, none of them own construction equipment, and none of them have ever completed a single project. Whispers spread throughout the ballroom. Clara moved to the next slide. A certificate of incorporation appeared. The name of the legal representative was enlarged on the screen. Clara Vance. Several people turned to look at her. Julian immediately pointed in her direction. "There, you see? The companies are registered in her name." Clara did not react. She opened another document. "This is the copy of my passport that was used to register the company. It was taken from my old personnel file at Vance Empire. The signature is not mine. The contact address belongs to Julian Vance's private office." Julian's face turned pale. "That was forged." "Yes," Clara said, and the person responsible logged into the system at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on March 17th. A side door to the ballroom opened. Evelyn Cross walked inside. She wore a simple gray suit and carried a laptop. Many members of the executive board recognized her immediately. She was Vance Empire's Director of Internal Audit. Arthur clenched his jaw. "What are you doing here?" Evelyn placed the laptop on the table. "I am doing the job you hired me to do." She connected the device to the screen. The server access logs appeared line by line. At 2:02 in the afternoon, Julian logged into the audit directory. At 2:17, he deleted the reports connected to the 4 suppliers. At 2:23, he copied the data onto a personal hard drive. Evelyn turned toward the room. "I recovered everything before the system was erased a second time." Julian lunged toward her. "You stole confidential data." Evelyn did not step back. "I preserved evidence." Arthur realized the situation was slipping beyond his control. He moved closer to Clara and lowered his voice. "Turn off the screen." Clara did not answer. Arthur continued. 30% of the company, the penthouse in Manhattan. Every debt you have will be erased. No one needs to know anything more." Clara stared at him for a long moment. 5 years ago, you used Mother's illness to force me into silence. Today, you still believe money can make me do the same thing again. Arthur spoke through clenched teeth. "Do not turn this into some kind of toxic family revenge." "No," Clara said. "This is a judgment against a manipulator." At that moment, the screen divided into several windows. Members of the board of directors appeared through an emergency video conference. The chairman of the oversight committee began speaking. "After reviewing the documents provided by Miss Cross and Miss Vance, the board will proceed with an immediate vote." Arthur spun around. "You cannot do this to me." The result appeared on the screen. Arthur Vance and Julian Vance were suspended from all positions. Executive accounts were frozen. Every transaction connected to the Central Harbor Bridge project was halted. No one applauded. No one needed to. Because at that moment, everyone in the ballroom understood that Arthur's empire had not been brought down by an outside enemy. It had collapsed under the weight of the secrets he had buried beneath his own daughter's name. The main doors of the ballroom burst open before Arthur could object to the result of the vote. Inspector Diana Ross entered with 6 officers from the Financial Crimes Investigation Unit. Unmelted snow still clung to their coats. Cold air swept in from the hallway, cutting through the suffocating heat inside the room. Diana raised the search warrant. Arthur Vance, Julian Vance, No one is permitted to leave. The ballroom immediately erupted into chaos. Guests who had been competing for the chance to shake Arthur's hand only minutes earlier began backing away from him. Investors lowered their eyes to their phones. The officials standing near the stage quietly moved to either side. Arthur looked at Mayor Marcus Sterling. "You planned this?" Marcus did not avoid his gaze. "No. You have been planning this for years. We merely collected what was left." Julian began breathing heavily. He looked at the screen, then at Evelyn, then at the police officers approaching him. The arrogance on his face disappeared so quickly that it seemed as though it had never existed. He turned toward his father. "You said the system would leave no trace." Arthur clenched his teeth. "Shut your mouth." But Julian was no longer obeying him. "You created the list of fake suppliers. You forced me to sign the contracts. You said that if I refused, you would bring Clara back onto the board and remove me from the company." Arthur slapped his son across the face. The sharp crack echoed through the room, exactly like the slap Julian had given Clara at the beginning of the party. Arthur pointed at him. "You are an idiot. I gave you everything, yet you were still incompetent enough to delete a folder without knowing where the backup was stored." Julian held his cheek and stared at his father with hatred. "You never gave me anything. You only turned me into the person who signed his name beneath all your crimes." Diana motioned for 2 officers to separate them. Clara stood a few steps away and watched calmly. For years she had believed her father was a man who could never be defeated. A single look from him had been enough to silence her. A single threat had been enough to make her abandon her career. But now, Arthur no longer looked like a powerful chairman. He was only an aging man trying to use his shouting to hide his fear. Clara suddenly understood that his power had never come from genuine strength. It had been built from the silence of everyone around him. Once no one was afraid anymore, the throne disappeared. Arthur turned toward her. "Clara, you have no idea what you are doing. If I fall, your name will be dragged down with mine." Clara reached inside her coat. She removed an old brown envelope, its edges folded and creased many times. Arthur saw it and immediately went still. For the first time that evening, real panic appeared on his face. "Where did you find that?" Clara did not answer immediately. She opened the envelope and removed a set of notarized documents. "This is Mother's original will." Julian frowned. "Mother did not leave a will." Clara looked at her brother. "That is what Father wanted us to believe." She held the documents up in front of the cameras, pointed toward the stage. "According to this will, Mother left me 1/3 of her personal shares in Vance Empire, along with ownership of the family trust. But 3 weeks after she died, another will appeared. In that version, every asset was transferred to Arthur." Evelyn opened a new file on the screen. The signature on the second will was copied from an insurance document. The witness was a legal employee who received money from one of the 4 shell companies. Arthur stepped backward. "That is a lie." Clara looked at him. Her voice was not loud, but it silenced the entire room. "No. The lie was the life you forced all of us to live." Diana stepped forward and accepted the documents. "With this evidence, the investigation will be expanded to include forgery of a will, theft of inherited assets, and money laundering." The officers placed Julian in handcuffs first. He did not resist. Arthur struggled, continuing to shout the names of his lawyers, members of the board, and people who once owed him favors. No one answered. When he was led past Clara, he stopped. "You destroyed this family." Clara looked directly at her father. "No, I simply stopped protecting the people who destroyed it." The doors closed behind Arthur and Julian. In the middle of a room created to celebrate an empire, Clara stood alone beneath the stage lights. She did not feel victorious. She only felt that the invisible chain around her neck had finally been removed. 11 months after that snowy night in Aspen, Arthur Vance entered the courtroom with no one walking behind him. No assistant. No security guards. None of the people who had once competed for a place beside him at parties. His black suit was still perfectly tailored, but his hair had turned much grayer. His wrists were locked together in front of his body. The man who had once controlled thousands of employees with a single phone call now had to wait for a police officer to give him permission to sit down. Clara sat in the back row. She had not come to watch her father be destroyed. She came because, for many years, Arthur had always told everyone else's story for them. He decided who was a traitor, who was ungrateful, and which truths were allowed to exist. Today, for the first time, the truth was being spoken without his permission. The prosecutor presented the chain of fraudulent contracts, intermediary accounts, and funds taken from the Central Harbor Bridge project. The 4 shell companies were only the outer layer. Behind them was a network of bribery, document forgery, and stolen assets that had operated for more than a decade. The forged version of Clara's mother's will became the evidence that expanded the case. Arthur had not only taken money from the corporation, he had taken his own daughter's future to feed the machinery of power he had created. When the judge sentenced him to 12 years in prison for commercial fraud, money laundering, document forgery, and breach of trust, Arthur kept his expression cold. But as he was led out of the courtroom, he turned back to find Clara. His gaze was no longer a command. It looked like a question. "Why did you not save me?" Clara did not answer. She had spent too many years explaining herself to a man who only listened when he could control the answer. Julian chose a different path. He agreed to cooperate with the prosecution, surrendered internal emails, and identified the people who had helped Arthur conceal the flow of money. In return, Julian received a lighter sentence. But his freedom still came at a price. All of his shares were confiscated. His luxury homes were sold to compensate for the damage. Business associations removed his name from their membership lists. The people who had once called him the perfect heir now refused even to mention him. During the final hearing, Julian looked at Clara and said that he had only followed their father's orders. Clara believed him. But understanding the reason did not erase the responsibility. Vance Empire stood on the edge of bankruptcy for several weeks. Many investors demanded to withdraw their money. Banks froze the company's credit lines. More than 800 workers feared they would lose their jobs because of crimes they had never committed. Evelyn Cross refused to let that happen. Under the supervision of the new board of directors, she dismantled the shell companies, disclosed every contract, and established an independent auditing system. Projects that lacked transparency were suspended. Executive bonuses were redirected into a worker protection fund. The Vance name remained on the building, but it no longer belonged to Arthur. For the first time, the corporation existed to serve the people working inside it, instead of protecting a family standing at the top. Clara recovered the inheritance her mother had left her, along with compensation from the civil lawsuit. She sold the Manhattan penthouse Arthur had once offered to purchase her silence. That money became the starting capital for the Vance Foundation for Investigative Journalism. The foundation supported independent journalists pursuing cases involving corruption, labor exploitation, and abuse of power. Clara also established a legal assistance program for people whose families had stolen their assets or used money to force them into silence. 1 year later, she returned to Aspen. The hotel still glowed brightly against the white snow, but Clara did not enter the ballroom from that night. She stood outside, watching the windows reflect light across the snow, then opened the small box she had brought with her. Inside was the black USB drive that had changed everything. Clara placed it in her palm and remembered the slap, the sound of the glass shattering, and the moment when she had believed she was walking into a room filled with people more powerful than she was. Now she understood that real power did not come from making other people afraid. It came from being able to walk away from the place that once controlled you without ever wanting to return and beg for its approval. The greatest act of toxic family revenge was not watching the people who hurt you lose their wealth or their reputation. It was refusing to let them decide who you were. Clara closed the box and walked down the snow-covered road. This time, no one forced her to leave. She chose to leave the past behind. And that was what it truly meant to be free from control. Clara's story reminds us that the most dangerous chains are often disguised as family loyalty. Walking away from toxic control does not make you selfish. Sometimes, it is the bravest decision you will ever make. Do you believe Clara was right to expose her father and brother, even if it destroyed the family empire? Share your opinion in the comments below. If this story moved you, please like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful family drama stories filled with betrayal, hidden truths, and unforgettable justice.